The night was tense, sirens piercing through the quiet streets as an ambulance sped toward the hospital. Inside, a paramedic named Marcus worked tirelessly, stabilizing a patient in critical condition. He had no idea that just moments ahead, his life was about to change forever. At the next intersection, flashing red and blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror. A police officer signaled for the ambulance to stop. Confused but complying, the driver pulled over. Officer Reynolds, known for his aggressive tactics, stormed up to the vehicle, anger already in his eyes. Without warning, he shoved Marcus aside, questioning why they were taking so long. When Marcus tried to explain, the officer's temper flared, and before anyone could react, he threw a punch. But then a panicked voice cried out from inside the ambulance, "Dad." The officer froze, his world suddenly flipped upside down. The word hung in the air, cutting through the chaos like a knife. Officer Reynolds' breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the ambulance. His son Liam lay on the stretcher, his face pale, his body weak. The same paramedic he had just assaulted was the one trying to save his child's life. Marcus, still reeling from the blow, clenched his jaw but stayed focused. "We need to move," he said firmly, ignoring the throbbing pain in his face. The officer stood frozen, eyes darting between Marcus and his son, his hands trembling. He had spent years enforcing the law his way, never second-guessing his actions until now. The ambulance driver hesitated, waiting for the officer to move. Every second lost could be the difference between life and death. But Reynolds wasn't just a cop in that moment. He was a father, and for the first time, he felt powerless. Marcus didn't have time to process the shock on the officer's face. Liam's breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. "We have to go." "Now," Marcus repeated, his voice edged with urgency. The driver gripped the wheel, waiting, but Officer Reynolds still stood in the way. Inside the ambulance, Liam's fingers twitched as he tried to lift his hand. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely there. That one word shattered something inside Reynolds. The badge on his chest suddenly felt heavier, the weight of his choices pressing down. He had spent years seeing people as threats before seeing them as human. But now, the man he had just attacked was the only one keeping his son alive. Marcus adjusted the IV, his hands steady despite the tension. He wasn't doing this for the officer. He was doing it for Liam. But the question hung in the air. Would Reynolds let them go, or would his pride cost him everything? The ambulance's engine rumbled, ready to speed off, but the officer still stood frozen, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to assert control, to not back down, but his son's fading breaths told him something else. Marcus didn't wait for permission. He reached for the defibrillator, his pulse quickening as Liam's vitals dropped. "He's crashing," he shouted. Reynolds' heart pounded. His son, his only child, was slipping away right in front of him. He had spent years believing he was always in the right, but now none of that mattered. All that mattered was Liam. Finally, something in him broke. He stumbled back, his hands falling to his sides, letting the ambulance pass. Marcus and the driver didn't hesitate. Tires screeched as they sped toward the hospital, leaving Reynolds standing alone in the flashing red and blue lights. He had spent years being the one in control, but now, for the first time, he realized he might lose everything. Reynolds stood frozen as the ambulance disappeared into the night, its sirens fading into the distance. His chest tightened, his mind clouded with panic and guilt. He had let his anger take control, again, but this time, it wasn't just another suspect or random bystander. This time, it was his own son's life hanging in the balance. Just as he turned toward his squad car, his radio crackled. "Officer down. We need immediate backup at 3rd and Oak," the dispatcher's voice rang through. Reynolds' stomach dropped. That was only a few blocks away. But before he could respond, another voice came through, his partner's. "Reynolds, it's bad. Suspect fled. We need you now." For the first time in his career, he hesitated. His son was fighting for his life at the hospital, and now his fellow officers needed him too. His hands clenched into fists. If he walked away now, he might lose everything, his job, his reputation. But if he didn't, he might lose something far more important. Reynolds gripped the radio, his pulse hammering. His instincts told him to respond, to jump back into the role he had always known. But as he stood there, another voice echoed in his mind, Liam's weak whisper, calling him Dad. For years, he had put the badge first. Now, for the first time, he realized he couldn't. Without a word, he threw the radio into his car and sped toward the hospital. The ride felt endless, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When he burst through the emergency room doors, his eyes locked onto Marcus, standing outside Liam's room, exhaustion written all over his face. Reynolds didn't know what to say. His throat tightened as he took a shaky step forward. Is he? Marcus held his gaze, then nodded. He's stable. Relief washed over Reynolds, but before he could respond, a doctor approached. You should know, she said carefully. Liam was asking for you, but when he woke up, he called Marcus Dad first. Reynolds' breath caught. The weight of his actions, of everything he had done, on the streets, to Marcus, to his own son, came crashing down all at once. Reynolds felt the air leave his lungs. His son had called another man Dad, not just any man, the same paramedic he had disrespected, the same man who had saved Liam's life. For years, he had believed respect came from authority, from control. But in that moment, he realized real respect was earned through compassion. Stepping into the room, he saw Liam, weak but awake. Their eyes met, and for the first time in a long time, Reynolds didn't see fear or disappointment, just quiet pain. Hey, kid, he said softly. Liam hesitated, then managed a small smile. Hey, Dad. Marcus gave them space, nodding as he stepped away. Reynolds turned to him, swallowing his pride. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus studied him for a moment before replying, Take care of your son. As Reynolds sat beside Liam, he realized that tonight hadn't just changed his son's life, it had changed his own.